In the sprawling chaos of the high school hallways, she moved like a whisper. Lockers slammed shut with metallic finality just feet from her, but the sound seemed to bend around her small frame. Groups of friends, laughing and shouting, formed temporary roadblocks, but they would part without ever seeming to see her, their conversations flowing back together as if she were just a brief gap in the air. She was the girl with the dark hair that always seemed to fall across her face, a living curtain she could hide behind. She wasn't bullied or ignored in a mean-spirited way. It was something far more profound. She was simply not there. A piece of the background scenery, like the scuffed linoleum floor or the faded posters encouraging school spirit. She had perfected this art of invisibility over years, finding a strange comfort in the silence it afforded her. She could observe everything without the pressure of having to participate. Her final class of the day was music appreciation, a course most students took to fill a requirement, treating it like a study hall with a soundtrack. The classroom itself was tired. A few dusty guitars stood in the corner, their strings sad and loose. An electric keyboard, its keys yellowed with age, sat on a metal stand at the front. The teacher, a man with kind but weary eyes, would try his best to spark interest. He'd play snippets of classical pieces, explain the origins of blues, or point out the structure of a pop song. Most students would nod along, their eyes glazed over, their minds clearly on their phones or the coming weekend. And in the very back row, by the window that looked out onto the sports fields, sat the invisible girl. She would open a notebook, her pen poised, but she rarely wrote a word. She just watched. She watched the teacher's passionate gestures fall flat in the apathetic air. She watched the jock in the front row try to discreetly text under his desk. She watched the quiet couple in the corner pass notes back and forth. To the teacher, she was just another name on his list, a blank space in the attendance chart. He never called on her, never asked for her opinion. Why would he? She gave no sign she had one to offer. She was just there, a quiet, dark-haired shadow fulfilling a credit when the final bell shrieked. Signaling the end of the day, the classroom would erupt in a sudden burst of energy. Chairs scraped, bags were zipped with a vengeance, and a tide of teenagers would pour out the door, eager for their freedom. She would always wait, letting the wave crash and recede before she slowly gathered her things. She walked home, a different kind of silence enveloping her. The chaotic noise of the school was replaced by the gentler sounds of her neighborhood, the distant hum of a lawnmower, the chirping of sparrows in the old oak trees, the rhythmic crunch of her own footsteps on the pavement. Her house was a small, modest place, and it was always empty when she arrived. Her parents worked long hours. The silence that greeted her was not lonely. It was a canvas, a wide-open space waiting to be filled. She would drop her bag by the door, not even bothering to turn on the lights. She would walk through the dim living room, her destination clear. There, in the corner, stood an old upright piano. Its wood was scuffed and scratched, a testament to years of use. It was slightly out of tune, a fact that only she seemed to notice, a faint imperfection in an otherwise perfect friend. This was not the same girl from the school hallway. This was not the invisible student. She would lift the heavy fallboard, revealing the ivory and ebony keys, and for a moment, her fingers would hover over them, a conductor poised before her orchestra. Then she would begin to play. The first notes that filled the quiet house were not simple scales or nursery rhymes. They were complex, cascading melodies that seemed to have a life of their own. Her fingers, which had been so still and lifeless in her lap all day, now danced and flew across the keys with a speed and grace that was breathtaking. She didn't need sheet music. The notes were inside her, a part of her soul. She played pieces by composers whose names were just vocabulary words to her classmates. Chopin, Debussy, Rachmaninoff. The music was her language. It was the anger she couldn't express when someone bumped into her in the hall without apologizing. It was the joy she felt watching a sunset from her window. It was the deep, aching sadness she couldn't explain to anyone. The old piano would vibrate, the sound swelling to fill every corner of the small house, chasing away the ghosts of silence. In these moments she was the most visible person in the world. She was a storyteller, a magician, a storm of emotion contained in a slight, quiet girl. This was her true level, a world of passion and precision that existed only behind the closed doors of her home, a secret masterpiece that no one at school had ever even thought to look for. The days in the music appreciation class continued in their usual rhythm of quiet indifference. The teacher would try to light a fire of passion for music in his students, and most of them would simply sit, letting the sparks die out before they could ever catch. The girl in the back remained a shadow, a part of the room's furniture. She had become so good at being invisible that she could almost convince herself she didn't exist in that space at all. Her real life, her vibrant and noisy life, began the moment she walked through her front door at home. Then, one Tuesday afternoon, the teacher clapped his hands together with a forced cheerfulness that immediately made the students suspicious. The lazy post-lunch energy in the room curdled into a wary quiet. He had an announcement. He stood in front of the dusty whiteboard, a nervous smile on his face, and told them about a new project he was calling Classroom Recital Day. His idea was simple. In a few weeks, everyone would have to get up in front of the class and perform something musical. It could be a song they wrote, a piece they were learning on an instrument, or even just singing a favorite song. He stressed the words low pressure and fun several times, as if saying them enough times could make them true. A collective groan rippled through the room. It was a sound of pure, unfiltered teenage dread. The jock in the front row slumped so low in his chair he almost disappeared. The girls who usually spent the class whispering to each other went silent, their eyes wide with horror at the thought of being put on the spot. A buzz of anxious whispers filled the air, everyone imagining their own moment of potential embarrassment. The girl in the back didn't move. She just kept her eyes fixed on the window, watching a single, stubborn cloud drift across a pale blue sky. This was just another classroom noise, another event that had nothing to do with her. She would find a way to get through it, just like she got through everything else. The teacher, trying to regain control, began to walk around the room with a clipboard, asking people what they might want to do. Most of the answers were mumbled and non-committal. I don't know, maybe a song on the guitar? I guess I could sing something. He was met with shrugs and downcast eyes. He was trying to be encouraging, to build a safe space, but his efforts were just making everyone more uncomfortable. As he made his way down the rows, the girl in the back could feel him getting closer. She willed him to skip her, to just write her down as undecided and move on, but he stopped at her desk. He looked down at his clipboard, then at her, and his expression softened with what he clearly thought was kindness. The entire class seemed to hold its breath. It was the most attention she had received all semester. "And for you," he said, his voice gentle and loud enough for the students nearby to hear, "we don't need anything big. No pressure at all. You could just come up and play a C major scale for us. Or, I know, how about Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star? That's a classic. Everyone knows that one." He smiled, proud of his accommodating suggestion. A few sharp little snickers cut through the quiet. They weren't loud, but they were incredibly sharp, like tiny needles. The girl felt a hot, sharp wash of shame crawl up her neck and burn in her cheeks. It was the feeling of being seen, but seen completely wrong. It was like being a priceless painting and having someone praise you for being a useful dust cover. His words, meant to lower the pressure, had instead placed 1,000-pound weight on her chest. He wasn't being kind. He was defining her. He was putting a label on her in front of everyone. The untalented one. The one who needed the easiest possible task. The musical equivalent of a child. She kept her head down, her hair falling to shield her face, but inside her something shifted. For years she had accepted her invisibility. She had found a strange safety in it. But this was different. This wasn't being invisible. This was being publicly and gently placed at the very bottom of the class. The quiet hum of resentment she sometimes felt began to grow into a roar. All the time she had been overlooked, all the times she had held her tongue, all the incredible, thundering music she held inside her that no one at this school would ever know existed, it all coalesced into a single, hard point of resolve in her stomach. She was tired of being underestimated. She was tired of being a ghost. That afternoon, the walk home was different. The world seemed sharper, more in focus. The gentle crunch of her footsteps on the pavement sounded like a march. The silence of her empty house wasn't a comforting blanket anymore. It was a rehearsal space. She didn't even drop her bag by the door. She walked straight to the old upright piano in the corner, her heart beating a determined, heavy rhythm against her ribs. She lifted the fallboard and her fingers hovered over the keys. For a moment, she thought about playing something simple, something to calm herself down. But the thought was quickly chased away. The teacher's voice echoed in her mind. "Twinkle, twinkle, little star?" A cold fire lit in her eyes. No, she would not play a nursery rhyme. She would not play a scale. She would play them all off the stage. She pulled out a stack of sheet music from the bench, her hands flipping through the pages with a new purpose. She bypassed the sonatinas and the nocturnes, the beautiful but gentle pieces she often played for herself. Her fingers stopped on a title, Chopin's Etude Op. 10, no, 12, the Revolutionary Etude. She remembered reading about it. It was a piece of pure fury and passion, written by a composer who had just heard that his homeland had been invaded. It was a storm of sound, a cry of anger and defiance. It was technically one of the most difficult pieces in the classical piano repertoire. A whirlwind of fast-paced notes and powerful chords that demanded everything a pianist had done. It was perfect. She placed the sheet music on the stand, though she didn't really need it. She knew every note. But this time, she wasn't going to just play it. She was going to weaponize it. She took a deep breath, placed her fingers on the keys, and began to play. The music that erupted from the old piano was not the gentle, flowing melody she usually practiced. It was a torrent. It was a declaration of war. Her fingers flew across the keys, a blur of motion, striking each note with a precision and power that made the entire room vibrate. She wasn't just playing the notes. She was pouring all of her frustration, all of her hidden passion, all of her quiet strength into every single chord. The Revolutionary Etude was no longer just a piece of music. It was her answer. It was her voice. And in a few weeks, the whole class was going to listen. The day of the classroom recital arrived with a strange, heavy energy in the air. It was the kind of quiet that isn't peaceful, but tense, like the moment just before a thunderstorm breaks. The teacher had rearranged the desks, pushing them to the sides of the room to create a makeshift performance space in the center. A few students had tried to decorate, taping up some crudely drawn musical notes on the whiteboard, but it only made the room feel more like a sad elementary school party. The old electric keyboard sat on its stand, looking lonely and exposed under the fluorescent lights. The girl in the back arrived as she always did, quiet and unnoticed, and took her usual seat. Today, however, the corner felt less like a refuge and more like a waiting room. She could feel a faint tremor in her hands, a nervous energy that she tried to still by clenching them into fists in her lap. The teacher stood at the front, beaming with a forced enthusiasm that didn't quite reach his eyes. He gave a little speech about courage and supporting each other, about how music was about expression, not perfection. The students listened with the same glazed-over expressions they always had, their minds clearly elsewhere. To them, this was just another hurdle to get over before the weekend. They had no idea they were about to witness a complete reshaping of their small classroom universe. The performances began, and they unfolded exactly as everyone expected. A popular girl, who was usually the center of attention, went first. She sang a catchy pop song that was all over the radio. She had a confident smile and moved to the beat, but her voice was thin and she drifted off key on the high notes. When she finished, the class applauded politely, the kind of applause that says, "Good job, you're done now." Next came a quiet boy who barely spoke in class. He carried an acoustic guitar that was almost as big as he was. His hands shook so much that he kept fumbling the chords of a simple folk song. He stopped halfway through, his face turning bright red, and mumbled an apology. The teacher quickly stepped in, clapping him on the shoulder and saying something encouraging, but the boy just scurried back to his seat, wishing he could disappear. The room was thick with a shared, uncomfortable feeling. A few more acts followed. A duo tried to beatbox a song, which ended up sounding more like they were choking. Another student played a very simple, plodding version of a movie theme on the keyboard, missing several notes. Each performance was met with the same polite, bored applause. The atmosphere remained flat. The girl in the back watched it all, her heart starting to beat a little faster with each passing act. She saw the anxiety, the half-hearted attempts, the general lack of passion. It made her own secret feel both more precious and more terrifying. What she was about to do didn't belong here. It was like bringing a lit match into a room full of damp paper. Then the teacher looked down at his list and called her name. A wave of apathy washed over the room. A few students shifted in their seats, ready for another round of awkwardness. The jock who sat in the front row leaned over to his friend and whispered something, and they both smirked, clearly remembering the teacher's twinkle, twinkle suggestion. The teacher gave her a gentle, encouraging nod, the same kind of pitying look he had given her before. He was just hoping she wouldn't be too embarrassed. She stood up. Every step toward the front of the room felt like walking through mud. Her legs felt heavy, and her throat was dry. She could feel dozens of pairs of eyes on her, but none of them really saw her. They just saw the quiet girl from the back, the one who was probably about to play a few clumsy notes. She reached the keyboard and hesitated for a moment. The whole world seemed to shrink down to this small, dusty corner of the classroom. She could hear the hum of the lights, the distant sound of a shouting from the hallway outside, the soft rustle of someone shifting in their seat. She took a deep, shaky breath and sat down on the cold metal bench. She didn't adjust the microphone or look at the audience. She just stared at the keys, her fingers hovering above them, and then she began. The first sound that exploded from the keyboard was not a note. It was a chord, a thunderous, angry chord that seemed to shake the very walls of the room. It was so loud, so full of fury, that a few students physically jumped in their seats. The lazy, bored atmosphere was instantly shattered, replaced by a sudden, sharp shock. Before anyone could even process what was happening, her fingers were moving. They weren't just pressing keys. They were flying, a blur of motion across the keyboard. A torrent of notes poured out, a cascading, roaring river of sound that was impossibly fast and complex. The room went completely still. The boy who was fidgeting with his phone froze, his thumb hovering over the screen. The couple in the corner who were whispering stopped, their mouths slightly agape. The jock's smirk vanished, replaced by a look of pure, unadulterated bewilderment. The music was not just loud. It was alive. It was a story of a battle, a cry of defiance, a storm of raw emotion. It had a darkness and a power that none of them had ever associated with music before. It wasn't background noise. It was a force that demanded to be felt, that reached into your chest and grabbed hold of your heart. The teacher was the most stunned of all. He had been leaning against his desk, pen in hand, ready to make a supportive note on his clipboard. When the first chord hit, the pen slipped from his fingers and clattered to the floor, but he didn't even notice. His mouth was hanging open. His eyes were wide, darting from the flying fingers on the keyboard to the face of the girl he had barely acknowledged all semester. Her head was bent, her dark hair hiding her expression, but her entire body was invested in the music. Her shoulders swayed, her foot tapped an urgent, frantic rhythm on the floor. She was no longer the quiet, invisible girl. She was a conduit for something immense and powerful. The piece surged forward, through moments of frantic, lightning-fast arpeggios to passages of deep, resonant chords that vibrated through the floor. The silence in the room was absolute. No one coughed, no one shifted. The only sound was the storm of music coming from the old electric keyboard and the quiet, frantic hum of its small speakers working harder than they ever had before. It was a performance that belonged in a grand concert hall, not in a dusty high school classroom. It was a level of skill and passion that was simply beyond their comprehension. They were witnessing something that shouldn't have been possible, a masterpiece erupting from the most unexpected of sources. Finally, the music reached its peak. A series of powerful, dramatic chords built to a final, triumphant crescendo that filled the room with a sound so full and complete it felt like it might burst. And then silence, not the bored, apathetic silence from before. This was a heavy, ringing silence, thick with shock and awe. The final chord seemed to hang in the air for an eternity, its vibrations slowly fading away. For a full 5 seconds, no one moved. No one breathed. It was as if the music had reset the entire room, and they were all waiting to see what would happen next. The spell was finally broken by a single, sharp gasp from a girl in the front row. It was followed by a slow, hesitant clap from someone else. Then, all at once, the room erupted. It wasn't polite applause. It was an explosion of sound, loud, raucous, and filled with a genuine, stunned amazement. People were on their feet, cheering and whistling. Faces that had been indifferent or mocking just moments before were now turned toward her with expressions of pure, unmasked respect, but the girl didn't turn around to take a bow. She didn't bask in the sudden, blinding spotlight. As the last note faded, she simply placed her hands back in her lap, her shoulders slumping slightly as if a great weight had been lifted. She stood up, gave a quick, almost imperceptible nod to the room, and walked back to her seat in the corner, pulling her hair over her face as if to hide once more. But it was no use. The spell was broken. She was invisible no more. The sound that filled the room was not the polite, tired clapping that had followed the other performers. This was different. It started with a single, sharp clap from a boy in the front row, a sound of pure, involuntary shock. Then, like a dam breaking, the rest of the class joined in. It wasn't just applause. It was an explosion of noise, a wave of sound that was loud, a little chaotic, and filled with a raw, undisguised awe. People were on their feet. Some were whistling, others were just staring, their hands moving together in a blur. The quiet, apathetic classroom had been completely and utterly transformed. The air, which just minutes before had been thick with teenage boredom, was now crackling with an electric energy. Every face was turned toward the front, toward the slight, dark-haired girl who had somehow summoned a storm from the old electric keyboard, but she didn't turn around. She didn't take a bow or offer a small, shy smile. As the final, powerful chord faded into the stunned silence, her shoulders slumped as if a great weight had suddenly been lifted and replaced by an even heavier one. The music was gone, and in its place was the deafening roar of the spotlight she had tried so hard to avoid. She simply stood up, pushed the bench back into place with a soft scrape, and began the long walk back to her seat. Every step felt strange, as if she were walking on a floor that was no longer solid. The eyes of her classmates were no longer just glances that slid past her. They were physical things, heavy and warm, following her every move. She could feel their shock, their confusion, and their newfound respect washing over her. It was overwhelming. She reached her corner and sank into her chair, pulling her hair forward like a shield, wishing she could make herself small again, to disappear back into the background where she felt safe. But it was too late. The invisible girl had been seen, and she could never be completely unseen again. The teacher was frozen by his desk, his hand still half raised in the air from where he had been about to make a note. His pen lay on the floor, forgotten. His mind was racing, trying to process what had just happened. He replayed the last few months in his head. All those times he had looked at the quiet girl in the back and seen nothing, a blank space, a student fulfilling a requirement. He had seen her stillness and had mistaken it for a lack of interest, her silence for a lack of thought. He had patted himself on the back for being so kind, for offering her an easy way out, a simple nursery rhyme. The memory of his own words, "Twinkle, twinkle, little star," now felt like a hot brand of shame on his skin. He had not just underestimated her. He had completely failed to see her. The person who had just played with the passion and skill of a seasoned concert pianist was the same person he had dismissed as being musically inept. The gap between his perception and the reality was so vast it made him feel dizzy. The bell rang, its shrill, metallic shriek cutting through the lingering energy in the room. It was a sound that usually signaled a mad rush for the door, a chaotic flurry of zipping bags and scraping chairs. But today, the movement was slower, more hesitant. Students gathered their things, but their eyes kept drifting back to the corner. The social landscape of the classroom had been irrevocably altered. The popular girl who had sung off-key now looked at the quiet pianist with a mixture of envy and wonder. The jock who had smirked earlier kept his head down, a faint blush on his neck. A few students hovered near her desk, as if they wanted to say something, but they didn't know the words. How do you talk to someone who just revealed a completely different universe inside themselves? Finally, one girl, the one who had passed notes with her boyfriend all semester, walked over. She didn't say anything. She just gave the quiet girl a small, genuine smile, a look that said, "I see you now." Then she turned and left. Soon the room was empty, save for the teacher and the girl in the corner. She was taking her time, carefully placing her notebooks into her bag, her movements slow and deliberate. She was trying to delay the moment she would have to walk out into the hallway, where she knew people would be looking at her, talking about her. The teacher took a deep breath, steeling himself. He knew he had to talk to her, but he had no idea what to say. "Sorry, I thought you were a beginner," seemed woefully inadequate. That was amazing, felt like an understatement of epic proportions. He walked away from his desk, not with his usual teacherly stride, but with a quiet, almost hesitant step. He didn't stop at her desk and stand over her. Instead, he did something that surprised even himself. He pulled up a chair from a nearby desk and sat down beside her, then leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. Putting himself at her eye level, she finally stopped packing and looked at him, her eyes wide and a little fearful, like a wild animal that wasn't sure if it was about to be trapped or helped. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The only sound was the distant hum of the school's ventilation system and the faint shouts from the sports fields outside. The teacher cleared his throat, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. "That was—" he began, then trailed off, shaking his head as if the words weren't good enough. He tried again. "What you played in here today. That was one of the most beautiful and powerful things I have ever heard. Not just in this classroom, anywhere." She didn't say anything. She just watched him, her guard still up, he continued, his gaze earnest and filled with a humility she had never seen in him before. "I have to ask, how long? How long have you been playing like that?" She shrugged, a small, almost invisible movement. "A long time," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Why?" he asked, and the question was filled with genuine curiosity, not accusation. "Why didn't you ever say anything? Why did you keep that incredible gift to yourself?" She looked down at her hands, which were clenched together in her lap. It was the question she had been asking herself for the last 10 minutes. Why had she done it? It was terrifying. Exposing the most private, most important part of herself felt like peeling off her own skin. She took a shaky breath and finally found her voice, a little stronger this time. It's mine," she said softly. "The music is just for me. It's the place where I don't have to talk. I don't have to be anything. I just, It's the only place where I feel like I'm good at something, and I didn't want anyone to ruin it." Her words hung in the air, and the teacher felt a fresh wave of guilt wash over him. He understood completely. He, and everyone else in this school, represented the potential for ruin. They were the judges, the critics, the ones who might not understand, who might laugh or dismiss it. His own well-intentioned but condescending offer of "Twinkle, twinkle, little star" was the perfect proof that her fears were justified. He had been about to ruin it without even knowing what it was. "I get it," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I really do. And I am so sorry. I'm sorry I didn't look harder. I saw a quiet student and I made an assumption. That's my fault, not yours. And I want you to know you don't have to be afraid of that here. Not with me." He looked at her, and for the first time she saw him not as a teacher, but as a person who was genuinely moved and truly sorry. "This changes things," he said, a new determination in his voice. "You can't stay in music appreciation. That's like asking a master painter to just stay inside the lines in a coloring book. We have an advanced orchestra, a jazz band. We have access to a real grand piano in the auditorium. We need to get you out of this class and into a place where you can really fly. What do you need? What can I do to help? The question was so unexpected, so full of support, that it almost scared her more than the performance had. This was it. The door to her secret world was not just open. Someone was standing on the other side, inviting her to walk through. She didn't have an answer. She just shook her head, a feeling of panic and a tiny flicker of hope fighting for control inside her chest. The teacher saw the conflict in her eyes and backed off a little. "Okay," he said gently. "You don't have to decide anything right now. Just think about it. But please, know this. You have a gift. A rare and beautiful gift. And it would be a crime against the world for you to keep it locked in that room with the out-of-tune piano forever." He stood up and pushed the chair back to its desk. She watched him, her mind a whirlwind of fear and possibility. She finished packing her bag, stood up, and walked to the door. As she stepped into the now empty hallway, she felt the same as she always did, but also completely different. The world hadn't changed, but her place in it had. The secret was out. And for the first time, it didn't feel like a disaster. It felt just a little bit like the beginning of something. The story of what happened in the music appreciation class didn't stay in that room. It spread through the school like a quiet current, a piece of news so strange and wonderful that it had to be shared. The quiet girl who played the piano like a storm became a kind of school legend. In the hallways, things were different for her. It wasn't that she suddenly became popular or that people flocked to her. That would have been a different kind of nightmare. Instead, the dynamic shifted entirely. When she walked past, the loud conversations didn't just stop. They softened. Students would watch her go by, not with pity or indifference, but with a kind of quiet respect. The jock who had smirked at her now gave her a hesitant, almost shy nod in the hallway. The girl who had sung the pop song made a point of smiling at her whenever they passed. She was no longer a ghost floating through the halls. She was a person, a real person with a depth that no one had guessed at. She was still quiet, she still kept to herself, but her invisibility was now a choice she made, not a curse placed upon her. The teacher was true to his word. He became her champion. The very next day, he called her into his office during a free period. He didn't have the old, tired electric keyboard in his room anymore. Instead, he had a stack of brochures for music conservatories and summer programs. He had already spoken to the counselor and the orchestra director. "It's all arranged," he said, his voice filled with an excitement that was contagious. "We're moving your schedule around. Starting Monday, you're no longer in my class. You'll be joining the advanced orchestra during that period." He saw the flicker of panic in her eyes and quickly added, "Don't worry. The director is thrilled. I played him a recording I took on my phone. He said he hasn't heard a high school student with that kind of touch in years." He then did something else that changed everything. He walked her over to the school auditorium. It was a huge, empty space with rows of red velvet seats stretching up toward a dimly lit stage. In the center of the stage, all alone, was a grand piano. It was black and shiny, a perfect, elegant beast that looked like it was sleeping. "This is yours now," the teacher said, his voice echoing slightly in the empty hall. "Whenever you want to practice, just come get the key from me. No more playing on that old keyboard in the corner." That afternoon, she went back to the auditorium by herself. She sat on the bench, the cool, smooth wood feeling different from the cold metal of the classroom chair. She lifted the heavy lid and gently ran her fingers over the keys. They felt more responsive, more alive than the ones on her old piano at home. She took a breath and began to play. The first notes that came out were not a storm, but a gentle, flowing melody. The sound was incredible. It didn't just fill the room. It soared. It rose up to the high ceiling and bounced off the back walls of the empty theater, surrounding her in a cloud of beautiful sound. For the first time, she was playing her music not just for herself, but for the space itself. It was a conversation between her and the empty hall, and it felt like coming home. Her new life in the advanced orchestra was strange at first. These were the music kids, the ones who lived and breathed their instruments. They were a tight-knit group, and she was an outsider. But here, her talent was her introduction. On her first day, the orchestra director, a stern woman with a sharp ear, simply pointed to the piano and said, "Show me." She played a short sonata, and when she finished, the director just nodded, a look of deep satisfaction on her face. The other students, who had been curious and a bit wary, were instantly won over. They didn't see the quiet girl from the back of the classroom. They saw a peer, a musician. They didn't pressure her to talk. They communicated through music, nodding along to her tempo, smiling when she nailed a difficult passage. It was a different kind of language, one she was fluent in. As the school year went on, she began to change in small ways. She started wearing her hair tied back more often, no longer needing it as a curtain. She would sometimes make eye contact with people in the hallways and offer a small, shy smile. She found that she didn't mind being seen as long as they were seeing the right thing. The biggest moment came at the end of the semester, when the school held its annual winter concert. The orchestra was the main event, and the director had a surprise for the audience. After the orchestra played a few pieces, she walked to the microphone. "We have a special treat for you tonight," she announced. "One of our students has a remarkable gift, and she has agreed to share it with us all. Please welcome our pianist." The girl walked out onto the stage. The auditorium was full, a sea of faces looking up at her. A single, warm spotlight found her, making the darkness around the stage even deeper. She felt a tremor of the old fear, the same nervousness she had felt in the classroom. But this time it was different. It wasn't a fear of being judged, but the healthy, exciting nerves of a performer. She sat at the grand piano, the polished wood gleaming under the light. She looked out at the crowd, but she didn't really see them. She saw her teacher in the third row, giving her an encouraging thumbs up. She saw the students from her old music class, their faces filled with anticipation. She took a deep breath, placed her fingers on the keys, and began to play. She chose the same piece. The Revolutionary Etude. It felt right, like closing a circle. The music that had shattered the silence of a small classroom now filled a large auditorium. It was bigger, more powerful, and even more full of emotion. It was the story of her journey from a hidden world of silence to this grand, open stage. The music thundered through the hall, a cry of defiance and a song of triumph all at once. When she played the final, triumphant chord, the sound seemed to hang in the air forever, echoing in the hearts of everyone listening. This time, the applause was immediate and overwhelming. The entire audience rose to their feet in a standing ovation. The sound was a roar of appreciation, a wave of love and respect that washed over her. And for the first time, she didn't run. She didn't hide. She stood up, walked to the front of the stage, and took a small, graceful bow. It was a simple gesture, but it meant everything. It was an acknowledgement of the music, and of the part of herself she had finally learned to share with the world. She was still the quiet girl, but everyone now knew the truth. Her silence was never empty. It was simply the space where a masterpiece was waiting to be born.